I have sat through 11 of these ceremonies in my 300 years, and I have despised every single one. The Grand Assembly calls them inductions. A pretty word for what they really are. A parade of the fortunate. Species after species marches across that dais to tell the galaxy how kind their sun was, how gentle their rain, how their oceans never rose to swallow their coastlines whole. They call it history. On Varen we call it luck, and luck is not a thing worth celebrating. I am Ashkar Threll, third warden of the Long Dark Line, and I did not want to be here. My matriarch sent me instead of coming herself, the same way she has sent me to the last 4 of these farces. You have the patience for it, she told me, which is her polite way of saying she does not. The Ashkar do not enjoy watching soft things congratulate themselves. It offends something old in us, something that remembers what it cost to still be alive at all. Before the humans, there were 4 other species inducted that cycle, and I sat through every one of them with the same practiced stillness I have perfected across 3 centuries of these ceremonies. The first was a species of aquatic filter feeders whose entire civilization had been built inside a single vast coral reef, untouched by storm or predator for longer than their written records could account for. Their delegate spoke for nearly an hour about the delicate art of harmonizing their society's needs with the reef's natural rhythms, and I found myself wondering, not for the first time, what it must be like to grow an entire civilization without once being forced to bury someone before their time. The second was a species from a moon so tidally locked to its parent world that half of it lived in permanent, gentle twilight, and the other half in permanent, gentle dusk. Neither hemisphere ever experiencing anything so dramatic as true night or true day. Their history, as far as I could follow it, consisted primarily of philosophical disputes about which twilight was superior. The third and fourth blurred together in my memory even as they happened. Soft worlds, soft skies, soft histories, each one another variation on the same fortunate theme. I clapped for none of them, the same way I clapped for none of them, and I watched Sen's 4 eyes track my restlessness with the patient amusement of someone who has spent decades waiting for me to finally understand why she keeps insisting I attend these things anyway. Varen does not forgive. That is the first thing you learn there, before you learn to walk, before you learn to speak. Our moon orbits a dying red dwarf that cannot decide whether to warm us or kill us, and so it does both, on a cycle none of us chose and none of us can stop. Every 140 years the star dims into what we call the long dark. Decades of failing light, failing warmth, failing crops, where the only creatures that survive are the ones who learn to slow their hearts to nearly nothing and wait. And then, without warning, it flares. Radiation storms strip the sky white for months. The ice that kept us alive becomes the thing trying to kill us, melting in walls of black water that erase entire creches in a single season. We do not have summers and winters on Varen. We have the waiting and the burning, and everything alive learned to survive both, or it did not survive at all. So forgive me if I find it difficult to sit still while some soft-skinned delegate describes a harsh winter that killed 12 people 300 years ago as though it were an epic. Forgive me if my patience, and the very patience my matriarch praised, wears thin somewhere around the 4th standing ovation for a species whose greatest historical trauma was a bad harvest. I settle into the observation gallery, my claws resting against the cold rail, and I watch the current speaker finish his account of the long winter of the eastern provinces. And I feel something in my chest that is not quite boredom and not quite contempt, but sits somewhere comfortably between the two. Then Chief Archivist Sen, of the Threll Vec Combine, leans toward me from the neighboring seat. Her 4 eyes catch the low light of the chamber, each one reflecting a different shade of interest. "You should stay for this next one, Warden," she says. I do not bother hiding my disdain. Let me guess. Their world had 2 seasons instead of 1. A truly harrowing existence. "You won't guess this one," she says, and there is something in her voice I have not heard from her before. Something careful, I do not trust careful. The lights dim in that theatrical way the assembly loves so much, and a new hologram blooms above the central dais. A small blue and green world, unremarkable at first glance, orbiting an ordinary yellow star. I have seen 1,000 worlds like it paraded across this chamber. I brace myself for another gentle garden, another lucky species who never had to earn a single day of their survival. The display begins to scroll data across its surface, and I lean forward despite myself because the numbers are wrong. They must be wrong. A world with a magnetic field that flickers and dies for stretches of 10,000 years, leaving the surface exposed to solar radiation that should sterilize anything without deep shelter. A world with a crust so unstable that entire mountain ranges rise and fall within the span of a single species' existence. A world that has been struck by objects large enough to blacken its sky for a decade, not once, but at least 5 times that the fossil record can prove. I look at Sen. She is watching me, not the display. "There's no possible way anything survived that," I say. "They did more than survive it," she says. "Watch." The hologram shifts, and I see the first true footage, not a curated historical reenactment, not a sanitized dramatization, but recovered records, raw and unedited. A city of towers stands beneath a churning ash-black sky, snow falling in summer, and in the streets below, small bipedal figures are still moving, still working, digging trenches into frozen ground, hauling stores of grain into shelters built from whatever materials they could find, carrying their old and their young between buildings that groan under snow they were never designed to hold. They are not fighting the sky. They cannot fight the sky. They are simply refusing to stop moving beneath it. Something old and quiet stirs in my chest. I know that posture. I have seen it in my own people during the worst months of the waiting, when there is nothing left to do but keep working and trust that the work will still matter when the light finally returns. "Who are they?" I ask. Sen's mandibles click together in something like a smile. "They call themselves humans," she says. "And Warden, I don't think they know how remarkable they are. I don't think it's occurred to them yet that most of the galaxy would have simply died." The human delegation enters through the western archway, and the entire chamber shifts its attention toward them, the way a held breath shifts before release. There are 3 of them. 2 hang back near the entrance, clearly aides or advisors, their postures deferential, their eyes tracking the room with the wary alertness of people who know they are being watched by beings who could end their species with a single vote. The 3rd steps forward alone, toward the podium, and I find myself studying her the way I would study prey, not out of hunger, but out of instinct, the old Verin reflex that catalogues everything before deciding whether it is dangerous. She is smaller than I expected, delicate even by the standards of a warrior species, no visible armor, no obvious weapon, skin unmarked by scale or chitin. My first read of her is unremarkable, and I feel the familiar disappointment settling back into my chest. The sense that whatever Sen saw in that footage, this creature standing before me cannot possibly carry it. Then I see her hands. They are wrapped, both of them in bands of woven cord from wrist to mid-forearm, and threaded along each band are small, dark beads, hundreds of them, packed so densely that from a distance her forearms look armored in a way nothing else about her is. My mind, trained on 3 centuries of Verin custom, reads it instantly as a trophy count. We wear the teeth of what we have killed. It is the oldest mark of status on my world, worn by warriors who have earned the right to be feared. I feel the ghost of respect stir in me before I have any right to feel it, and I hate myself a little for how quickly my instincts leap to a conclusion I have not earned. She reaches the podium. Her voice, when it comes, is quiet, not weak but measured, the voice of someone who has learned that volume is not the same thing as authority. My name is Amara Osei, she says. I lead something my people call the Reclamation Corps. My job, for the last 19 years, has been showing up after everything has already gone wrong. A ripple of polite confusion moves through the gallery. This is not how these introductions usually go. There is no proud recitation of technological milestones, no boast of unification or progress. She has opened with failure, and I do not think anyone in this chamber besides myself and Sen understands why that might be the most honest thing anyone has said from that podium in a decade. I lean forward. My claws dig faint grooves into the rail. Let me tell you what our planet is like, she says, before I tell you what my people did about it. The hologram above the dais changes again, and this time it does not flatter. Earth spins slowly in the display, blue and green and achingly ordinary, and then Amara begins to strip away the illusion of gentleness one layer at a time, the way a hunter skins something to show you what was hiding beneath its coat. 75,000 years ago, she says, a volcano in what we now call Indonesia erupted with a force that darkened our skies for the better part of a decade. Global temperatures dropped. Forests that had fed our ancestors for 100,000 generations died in a single winter that lasted years. She pauses, and I notice she does not soften the number that follows. Genetic evidence suggests our entire species, every human alive on the planet at that time, was reduced to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. The chamber goes very quiet. I understand numbers. Every species in this room understands numbers. But I do not think most of them understand what that number actually means, so I do the calculation myself, the way my matriarch taught me to when I was young enough to still need teaching. 10,000 individuals is not a population, it is a single settlement. It is the population of one creche hall on Verin during a bad waiting season. It is a number so small that a single disease, a single bad harvest, a single act of violence between rival groups could have erased my entire species from existence forever. We nearly didn't make it, Amara says, and there is no drama in how she says it, no theatrical weight. It is simply a fact she has made peace with. Most species, when I've told this story to other delegations, ask me what saved us, what miracle, what advantage. She looks up, and for the first time her eyes sweep the gallery, and I feel the weight of her gaze even from this distance. Nothing saved us, we just didn't stop. The hologram shifts again. I watch as small bands of humans, generation after generation, spread outward from a single point on the map, crossing deserts that should have killed them from thirst alone, crossing ice bridges in temperatures that would freeze the blood in my own veins within minutes, crossing oceans in vessels that look, to my eye, barely more sophisticated than hollowed logs. They do not wait for the world to become survivable. They simply walk into it, generation after generation, and somehow, impossibly, the walking never stops. We rebuilt from 10,000 people to 8 billion, Amara says. And in between those two numbers, we nearly lost everything more times than I can count in a single presentation. She does not rush through the list, and I understand, watching her, that she has chosen each entry deliberately, the way I would choose which names to read first when a counting circles list runs longer than a single breath can carry. Roughly 12,000 years ago, the end of our last ice age flooded coastlines that entire early civilizations had been built along, erasing settlements so completely that for most of our recorded history, we assumed those civilizations had never existed at all. We only started finding them again a few centuries ago, underwater, and we're still finding more. The hologram shows a coastline receding beneath rising water, slow and merciless. Structures disappearing beneath the surface over the course of generations too gradual for any single lifetime to fully witness. Imagine losing your ancestors so completely that your descendants have to invent archaeology just to prove you existed at all. Roughly 700 years ago, a plague swept across one of our continents and killed, by conservative estimate, a third of the entire population within 5 years. Entire villages emptied, entire trades, the specific knowledge of how to work certain crafts, died out because every person who knew how to do them died faster than anyone could apprentice beneath them. She lets the numbers sit. A third, Warden. Not a third of the sick. A third of everyone. Roughly 100 years ago, we fought 2 wars on a scale our own ancestors would not have believed possible, using weapons that could kill from further away than the eye can see. Ending the second one with a device capable of erasing an entire city in less time than it takes to finish a sentence. We built that weapon ourselves. We used it ourselves. And in the same century, we also invented vaccines that saved more lives than every war of that century combined managed to end. She spreads her hands, and I notice, not for the first time, how the beads catch the light differently depending on how she moves. Some catching bright, some staying dark, as though even the light itself cannot decide how to hold that many losses at once. That's the part I think this council struggles with, she says. You keep looking for the single catastrophe that defines us, the one volcano or one war or one plague that explains what we are. There isn't one. There have been dozens. Some we caused ourselves, some the planet handed us with no warning at all. And every single time, on the other side of it, we did the same 2 things. We counted what we lost, as honestly as we could stand to. And then we started building again before the counting was even finished. The hologram cycles faster now, decades compressing into seconds. Collapsed cities rising again in new shapes, populations that had been culled by a third or more within living memory, doubling and doubling again within a handful of generations. Seed stores rebuilt, trade routes reopened, songs and stories that should have died with the last person who remembered them somehow surviving, passed mouth to mouth through the worst of the collapse, waiting on the other side for someone to need them again. I don't have a tidy word for that, Amara says. I've heard other species call it resilience. I think that word is too gentle for what it actually costs. Resilience sounds like something that doesn't hurt. Everything I just showed you hurt. It hurt for generations. We built anyway. She lets that sit in the silence of the chamber for a long moment. I'm not here to tell you humanity is strong, she says finally. Strength is easy to measure and easy to be impressed by, and it isn't really the thing that kept us alive. I'm here to tell you humanity is stubborn in a way I don't think this council has words for yet. We don't stop rebuilding, not because we're certain it will work. Most of the time, historically, the odds said it wouldn't. We rebuild because the alternative is unbearable, and somewhere along the way, being unable to bear the alternative became the most powerful force our species has ever produced. I find that my claws have gone still on the rail. I am not disappointed anymore. I am something else entirely, something I have not felt in this chamber in 3 centuries of sitting through soft, easy stories from soft, easy worlds. I am afraid, in the specific way that only comes from recognizing something in a stranger that you had believed belonged only to your own kind. The hologram shifts one final time, and I understand, watching it, that Amara Ose has saved the hardest truth for last. The way a warrior saves their strongest blow for when the opponent has already lowered their guard. I want to show you something my ancestors built, she says. Roughly 600 years before any of them had the technology to understand why they were doing it. The image resolves into a structure of pale stone, towers reaching skyward, delicate stained glass, catching a sun that does not exist in this chamber. It is beautiful in a way I do not expect from a species whose history I have just watched drown in fire and ice and its own violence. This cathedral took over 200 years to build, Amara says. The people who laid its foundation stones knew, with absolute certainty, that they would be dead long before it was finished. Their children would be dead before it was finished. In some cases, their grandchildren would be dead before it was finished. She lets the image linger. They built it anyway. Generation after generation of stonemasons who would never see the completed work, pouring their lives into something for people they would never meet. I do not understand, at first, why this matters more than the volcanoes, more than the ice, more than the wars. And then I do, and the understanding lands in my chest like a physical blow. On Verin, during the worst of the long dark, my people cull. It is not spoken of with shame. It is simply survival, the oldest law of our world. When the food will not stretch to feed the creche through to the burning, the elders make the calculation, and the sick, the old, the ones least likely to see the light return are given their rest, so that the ones who might survive have a chance to. It is not cruelty. It is arithmetic. I have always believed it was the reason my people are still alive at all. The willingness to do the math the universe demands, no matter how much it costs us to do it. Humanity's cathedral tells me they did something different. Not once, but again and again, in 1,000 different forms across their entire history. They built seed vaults buried in ice for crops that would not be needed for a century. They planted forests they knew they would never sit beneath the shade of. They had children in the wreckage of cities still burning from the last war, when every rational calculation said that world had no future worth bringing a child into. They looked directly at the math, understood it as clearly as any Ashkar elder ever has, and chose to defy it anyway. After the worst plague in our recorded history, Amara says, her voice dropping into something quieter, more private. When 1/3 of an entire continent had died within 5 years, the birth rate on that continent rose, not fell, rose. My historians have theories about why. I have my own. I think when everything has been taken from you, having something to protect becomes the only answer that makes any sense at all. The chamber is utterly silent now. I look around and see delegates from 12 soft, gentle worlds staring at that hologram, with expressions I do not have names for in my own language. Something between horror and awe. The specific vertigo of realizing the story you thought you understood was actually a different, far larger story, wearing a familiar shape. I am not looking at the hologram anymore. I am looking at the beads on Amara Osei's forearms. And for the first time, I understand that I have been wrong about what they mean since the moment I saw them. She finishes the presentation with numbers, the way I would finish mine, the way any Ashkar would finish theirs, not to shock the chamber, but because numbers are the only honest language left when the story has gone past what softer words can carry. Across our recorded history, she says, somewhere over 200 million of us died in wars we started against each other. Tens of millions more in famines, most of them caused not by nature but by our own failures of governance. Disease has killed us in numbers I genuinely cannot make emotionally real to you, because I cannot make them emotionally real to myself. And I have devoted my life to standing in the wreckage those numbers leave behind. She pauses, and something shifts in her face. Not performance, not rehearsed gravity, but a private cost surfacing despite her control. I have personally been unable to save 431 people, she says quietly. That is what these beads are. Not trophies, not honors. I wear the weight of every person my team reached too late, so that I never let myself forget what it costs when we're not fast enough, or good enough, or lucky enough. Her voice does not break, but it comes close. I add a bead the week after I lose someone, not the day. The week, because the day I am still hoping I am wrong. The chamber holds its silence. I feel something in my chest that I do not have a word for in Ashkar, something my language has never needed a word for, because nothing on Verin has ever survived long enough to grieve on this scale and still choose every single time to keep going back into the wreckage. We do not mourn what the long dark takes. We cannot afford to. Grief, on my world, is a waiting season luxury, rationed the same as food, spent only on those close enough to the creche to matter and never ever spent on strangers. Amara Osei has apparently spent 19 years of her life grieving strangers on purpose, by choice, in a role she volunteered for. I don't know what my planet's greatest strength is, she says, closing the presentation. I've stopped trying to find a single word for it. But if you want to understand humanity, don't look at our wars. Don't look at our disasters. Look at what we do the week after. We rebuild. We plant the tree we won't live to sit under. We have the child in the ruins. We add the bead, and then we go back out the next morning, because somewhere in our history, we decided that giving up was a worse fate than losing. She is quiet for a moment after saying it, and then, unprompted, she tells the chamber about one of them. Not all 431. She says she has never told all 431 to anyone, not even her own people, but one. The one she says taught her what the beads were actually for. 11 years ago, she says, there was a building collapse in a coastal city after a magnitude 8 earthquake. Apartment block, mostly families. We had 31 hours before the structural engineers told us the remaining section was going to come down entirely, with or without us still inside it. She does not raise her voice. If anything, it grows quieter, and the chamber leans in to compensate. We found a woman on hour 29, trapped under a support beam, talking to her daughter through a gap in the rubble the width of 2 fingers. The daughter was already gone, had been gone for hours. The mother didn't know that. I made the decision not to tell her because I needed her calm enough to help me get her out, and I told myself I would tell her the truth once she was safe. The hologram doesn't show this. Amara has chosen deliberately to let the chamber sit with only her voice and no image, and I understand, watching the softer delegates flinch at the bareness of it, that this is a mercy she is not extending to herself. We lost the support beam at hour 30, she says. Not her fault, not mine. Just physics, doing what physics does when you ask a damaged structure to hold longer than it was ever built to hold. I was 11 feet away when it went. I have never, in 19 years, gotten those 11 feet back in my head. I run them every single night, differently, faster, and in every single version I still don't make it. She lifts her left arm, and for the first time she touches one specific bead near the center of the band, distinguishable from the others only to her. This one is hers, she says. I don't know if she ever learned her daughter didn't make it. I choose to believe she didn't have time to. I have decided that is the only kindness I am still able to give her 11 years later. And I give it to her every day, whether she needs it, anymore or not. No one in the chamber speaks. I look around at gentle worlds who have spent their entire histories being spared exactly this kind of arithmetic, and I watch them understand, perhaps for the first time in their existence, that survival is not always measured in who lived. Sometimes it is measured in what the living choose to carry afterward, and for how long and how honestly. I think of the memory halls of Verin, where we seal names away and refuse, by custom, to speak them again. I think of how certain I have always been that this was mercy, that forgetting was the only sustainable way to survive centuries of loss. Watching Amara Osei touch a single bead in front of an audience of strangers, I am no longer certain of anything I believed before I walked into this chamber. The lights rise. The ceremony, by every formal measure, has ended. I do not move for a long time. Around me, delegates from a dozen worlds are murmuring to each other in the specific tone of beings who have just watched something reorganize their understanding of a species they had already filed away as unremarkable. I catch fragments of it as the gallery empties around me. The tidal-locked delegate from the Twilight Moon is arguing quietly with an aide about whether the humans' presentation constituted a formal threat display, as though 431 beads were the same category of object as a weapon. The reef dwellers are simply gone, retreated back to whatever gentle corner of the chamber makes them feel safe again, unwilling or unable to sit any longer with a story that had no coral in it, no harmony. Nothing but a species clawing its way forward through math that should have ended it. Two delegates I do not recognize, from a combine world near the outer trade routes, are speaking in low, urgent tones about revising the standard threat assessment protocols. I hear the word unprecedented twice, and the word recommend monitoring once, in the particular flat diplomatic register that soft worlds use when they mean we are afraid and do not know how to say so honestly. None of them are looking at Amara Ose directly. They are looking at the space where her presentation used to be. The way a creature looks at the place a predator was standing after it has already moved somewhere it can no longer be seen. I find something almost like sympathy for them, buried beneath my own unease. They have spent their entire histories being spared this particular kind of understanding. It is not their fault they do not know what to do with it now that they have it. Somewhere near the far exit, I catch sight of the reef delegate's aide whispering urgently to a colleague. The word reassess, surfacing twice in a tone that makes clear the assembly's comfortable categories no longer feel quite so stable as they did this morning. I find, to my own surprise, that I take no satisfaction in their unease. I am too occupied with my own. Sen leans toward me again, her four eyes catching the returning light. "Well, Warden," she asks, "still think it's just a bad winter?" I do not answer her immediately. I am watching Amara Ose step down from the dais, her wrapped forearms catching the light. 431 small, dark beads moving against her skin like a tally the galaxy has no idea how to read. "I need to speak with her," I finally say. I find her near the edge of the lower promenade, away from the crush of delegates still processing what they have just witnessed. She is alone for the moment, her two aides occupied elsewhere, and she is looking out through the observation window at the star field beyond, her expression unreadable to anyone who has not spent 3 centuries learning to read exhaustion on faces that have decided not to show it. She sees my reflection in the glass before I speak, and I watch her shoulders set. Not in fear, I realize, but in the specific readiness of someone who has learned that difficult conversations rarely announce themselves politely. "Warden," she says, turning. Her voice carries none of the tremor I would expect from prey standing in front of something twice its size, claws visible, spines still faintly raised from the tension of the ceremony. "I saw you in the gallery. You didn't clap." "I do not clap," I say. "It is not a custom my people practice. Neither is standing very, very still while staring at someone for a full presentation," she says. And there is something dry in it, something almost like humor. But you managed that just fine. I find myself doing something I have not done in this chamber in 300 years. I laugh. A low sound, rough, more growl than mirth to any ear that does not know my people, but she does not flinch from it. She studies me for a moment, the same unhurried assessment I imagine she gives to a damaged structure before deciding whether it is safe enough to enter. I do not think she is afraid of me. I think she is doing the same arithmetic I have been doing since the ceremony ended, weighing what she has seen against what she already believed, and finding the two numbers do not match. "You know," she says, "most delegations send a handler to make first contact after a presentation like that. Someone whose entire job is smoothing things over, making sure the scary parts of the story don't linger too long in anyone's memory. You're the first person who's walked straight up to me looking like you want to talk about the scary parts specifically. The soft parts of your presentation do not interest me," I say. "Any world can grow soft things. I have watched 4 of them do exactly that this cycle alone, and I will forget all 4 before I reach my ship. I did not expect to still be thinking about a human 3 hours after her presentation ended. Something flickers across her face, not quite surprise, but close to it. The particular expression of someone who has spent 19 years being complimented on the wrong things and has nearly forgotten what it feels like to be seen accurately instead. On Varen, I say, we have a greeting. It is not a handshake. It is not a bow. It is this. I lower my head, exposing the unarmored line of my throat toward her, the single most vulnerable point on any Ashkar body, the place every predator on my world has learned to strike first. It is not a gesture we offer casually. Among my own kind, it is offered only to those we have decided are not a threat, and more rarely still, to those we have decided we would trust with the choice not to become one. She understands the weight of it immediately. I see it settle into her expression. That's a big ask for someone you met 4 minutes ago, she says quietly. You spent your presentation showing this entire chamber your throat, I say. 431 times, if I understand the count correctly. I am only doing what you have already done in front of a much larger and much less trustworthy audience. She is quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reaches up and rolls back her left sleeve fully, exposing the entire length of the bead-wrapped band from wrist to elbow, holding it toward me not as a boast, but as an offering. The same vulnerability I have just offered her, translated into whatever the human equivalent of a throat happens to be. Then you should know exactly what you're bowing to, she says. I have not felt this particular mixture of respect and unease in longer than I can accurately remember. I do not think it is fear, precisely. I think it is the specific vertigo of meeting something that survives the same way I survive, but has chosen to pay a cost for it that my own people abandoned generations ago as an unaffordable luxury. Come, I say. There is a place in the lower levels where the air still carries heat, and the drinks are not served in glasses too small for a real hand. I would like to hear about the 431. Something crosses her face. Surprise, I think, that I would ask about the cost rather than the count. Most delegations ask how many we've saved, she says. I do not care how many you have saved, I say. Any soft world can boast of victories. I want to know what it costs you to keep counting the ones you could not. For the first time since she stepped onto that dais, Amara Osei smiles, not the careful, measured expression she wore for the chamber, but something smaller and more real. All right, Warden, she says, buy me that drink. The lower levels of the assembly complex do not welcome delegates from the gentle worlds. The air is heavier here, thick with the mineral scent of Varen incense and the low murmur of species who understand that comfort is not the same thing as safety. I choose a table in the deepest corner, away from the wandering eyes of beings who have never once had to bury their own dead with their own hands. A server brings 2 drinks, mine dark and viscous, distilled from fermented creche root, hers something the kitchens have clearly improvised from whatever compounds their analysis suggested her biochemistry could tolerate. She sniffs it once, takes a cautious sip, and does not immediately regret her choice, which earns a flicker of respect from me before either of us has said another word. Tell me about Varen, she says, properly. Not the version you'd give the assembly. So I tell her. I tell her about the long dark, about the specific texture of cold that settles into your bones during the 4th decade of a failing star, about creches that go silent 1 chamber at a time as the elders make their calculations and the sick are given their rest. I tell her about the burning, when the same star that nearly starved us tries instead to cook us alive, when the ice we depended on for a century becomes a flood that erases whole settlements in a single season. I tell her, though I have never told any off-worlder this, about the culling. She does not flinch. She does not offer the soft, useless pity I have learned to expect and despise from gentler species. She simply listens, the way I imagine she has learned to listen to every survivor she has ever pulled from a collapsed building, waiting for the whole truth rather than reaching for the comfortable half of it. "We used to do something similar," she says when I finish. Not as formalized, not as honest about it either. We dressed it up in politics and called it triage, called it resource allocation, pretended it wasn't the same math your elders are doing when they decide who gets to see the burning. She turns her glass slowly between her fingers. The difference, I think, is that somewhere along the way, we started treating every failure to save someone as a debt instead of a fact. Your people call it arithmetic. Mine calls it a moral injury. I don't know which of us has the healthier relationship with reality, honestly. "You wear the debt on your arms," I say. "That is not a small thing to carry." "It's not supposed to be small," she says. If it stopped hurting, I think that's the day I'd stop being any good at this job. The beads aren't punishment, Warden. They're a promise. Every one of them is a person I failed, and every one of them is also a person I refuse to let become just a statistic in a report nobody reads. I think of my matriarch, of the calm, practiced voice she uses when she reads the names of the culled during the long, dark ceremonies, names that are spoken once and then, by custom, never spoken again. We do not keep count on Verin. We have always believed that counting the cost would break something necessary in us, some armor against grief that lets us keep functioning through decades of scarcity. Amara Osei has built her entire species' philosophy on the opposite belief, that refusing to count the cost is the thing that breaks you eventually, in ways you do not see coming until it is far too late to repair. "You asked me something in the corridor," she says. "You said you didn't care how many we've saved. I want to actually answer that properly, if you'll let me." I incline my head. "We've pulled about 60,000 people out of collapsed buildings, flood zones, and burn sites since I started this job," she says. 60,000 against 431. Most people would call that a good ratio. I used to think it was too back when I started. I don't think that anymore. Why not? Because the 431 are the ones who taught me everything I actually needed to know, she says. Every rescue that goes right confirms what you already believed about how to do the job. Every rescue that goes wrong rewrites the whole job from the ground up. The dead are better teachers than the living, Warden. It's an ugly thing to say out loud, but it's true, and I've decided I'd rather say ugly true things than comfortable false ones. I lift my glass. On Verin, this gesture means something specific, an acknowledgement between equals, who have both paid a price the rest of the world will never understand. She does not answer right away. She simply looks at her own glass for a moment, as though weighing whether the toast I'm about to offer is one she is ready to hear from someone who has known her for less than a single evening. To the ones you could not save, I say. She lifts hers to meet it. To the ones we keep trying for anyway, she says. Even when the math says we shouldn't. We drink. The bitter root liquor burns down my throat in the way it always does, and across from me, this small, unarmored, impossibly stubborn creature does not cough, does not flinch, simply matches me swallow for swallow with the same quiet defiance I watched her level at a chamber full of beings who could have voted her entire species into irrelevance an hour earlier. We talk long after the drinks run out and the server stops bothering to check on us. And somewhere in that long, unhurried conversation, I stop thinking of her as a delegate and start thinking of her as something closer to what my own people would call kin by choice. A bond Verin custom reserves for those outside the creche who have proven through cost rather than convenience that they understand what survival actually demands. She tells me about the cathedral again, in more detail this time. How the stonemasons who laid its foundation kept careful records, passed hand to hand across 2 centuries, so that no single mason's death could halt the project, so that the knowledge of the work outlived any one worker's brief, breakable life. She tells me about the seed vaults, buried in mountains of ice on the theory that someday something would go wrong badly enough that her descendants would need a second chance at growing food from scratch, and that theory alone was worth burying seeds for 100 years against a threat none of the builders would live to see arrive or be proven wrong about. I tell her about the memory halls of Verin, where we store not seeds but names. Every elder who has ever made the calculation during a long dark, every name of the culled, sealed away and never spoken but never erased either. A debt my people acknowledge exists even as our culture insists we cannot afford to carry its weight openly. Maybe that's the real difference, she says quietly, turning her glass in the low light. Not that your world is harder than mine, or mine harder than yours. I don't think that's a competition worth having. I think it's that your people learn to survive by making peace with what has to be let go. Mine learn to survive by refusing to make that peace, ever, even when it costs us more than it should. Which of us is right, I ask, and I am not certain, asking it, whether I actually want an answer. She considers the question longer than I expect. I don't think either of us is right, she finally says. I think we're both still alive, which is the only proof either philosophy has ever actually offered. But I'll tell you what scares me a little sitting here with you. She meets my eyes, and there is no performance left in her at all, just plain honesty, the kind that costs something to give. I think a species that knows exactly when to let go, paired with a species that has never once learned how. That's either the beginning of something the rest of this galaxy is going to be very glad exists, or something they're going to spend the next century regretting they ever introduced themselves to. I do not have an answer for her. I am not certain, sitting in that low, warm room with a creature who wears the weight of 431 strangers on her own skin by choice, that there is a comfortable answer to give. Perhaps it does not need to be one or the other, I say, eventually. Perhaps it